Today, we're tackling a really pivotal moment, an election that, honestly, shaped the map of the U.S. we see today. Forget quiet politics. 1844 was, well, fiery.
Absolutely fiery. It's hard to overstate its impact. You have to picture the U.S. in the early 1840s.
Right.
There's this huge westward push. Manifest destiny is really taking hold as an idea.
That sense of inevitable expansion.
Exactly. But at the same time, the country is dealing with some serious internal problems. Deep cracks were showing.
Okay, let's get into those cracks. What were the big dividing lines back then?
Well, the biggest, without a doubt, was slavery. It was the issue.
North versus South.
Constantly. And tied right into that was the question of new territories. Would they be slave or free? Plus, the economy was still shaky from the panic of 1837.
Ah, right. So people were anxious economically, too.
Very anxious. And that economic stress, it made promises of new land and opportunities sound pretty appealing to a lot of voters.
And right in the middle of all this, Texas.
Smack dab in the middle. Texas was its own republic then, having broken from Mexico.
Independent.
Yep. And the question was, should the U.S. annex it, bring it into the Union? It became this huge flashpoint.
Threatening to just split the country apart.
Pretty much. It touched on slavery, on expansion, on relations with Mexico, everything.
So that's our mission for this deep dive then.
Sure.
To really unpack how this election, with all that tension swirling around, fundamentally changed the country's physical shape and maybe its destiny.
Exactly. And to understand that, we really need to look at who was running and what they stood for in that really charged atmosphere.
Let's flip up with the Democrats. They had a former president, Martin Van Buren, wanting the nomination again. Seemed like he'd be the front runner.
You'd think so, but Van Buren had a big problem. Texas, he was against annexing it immediately.
Why was that?
Well, he worried it would mean war with Mexico, which was a valid concern.
Okay.
And crucially, he knew it would pour gasoline on the fire over slavery. He wanted to avoid that.
But that position didn't play well everywhere.
Not at all, especially not in the South. Southern Democrats really wanted Texas, largely for the expansion of slavery. Van Buren's stance cost him dearly.
So if Van Buren was struggling, who stepped into that gap for the Democrats?
This is where James K. Polk comes in. He wasn't a household name nationally at the time. People called him a dark horse.
A surprise candidate? What was his background?
He'd been Speaker of the House, Governor of Tennessee. Respectable, but not, a political superstar. But he had a very, very powerful supporter in his corner, Andrew Jackson. Old Hickory's blessing meant a lot.
And Polk wasn't shy about his plans, was he?
Not at all. He came out swinging with a really clear, bold platform. Annex Texas now.
Immediately.
Yes. And also assert American control over the entire Oregon Territory, all the way up to latitude 54 degrees 40 north.
54-40 or fight?
That was the slogan. It was incredibly effective. Polk basically embodied this aggressive expansionist spirit, this belief that America was destined to stretch across the continent. No ambiguity there.
Okay, so that's Polk. What about the opposition, the Whigs? They nominated a big name.
A huge name, Henry Clay. The great compromiser.
Right, a political giant. Lots of charisma, tons experience.
Definitely. He'd been a major figure for decades, brokered deals, run for president before. He seems like the obvious choice for the Whigs.
But Texas tripped him up too, didn't it?
It really did. See, Clay initially came out against annexation, probably trying to keep the slavery issue contained, keep his northern and southern wings happy.
The classic balancing act.
Right. But then he started feeling pressure, especially from the South, so he began to, waffle a bit.
How so?
He sent out some letters suggesting maybe annexation could be okay under certain conditions. He tried to nuance it.
And that didn't work.
It backfired badly. This hesitation, this perceived flip-flopping made him look indecisive.
Who did he alienate the most?
Anti-slavery Northerners. They saw him compromising his principles, potentially opening the door to more slave territory. And a lot of those voters, instead of sticking with Clay, peeled off and supported the Liberty Party.
A third party.
Exactly. Dedicated solely to abolition. They didn't win any states, but they took enough votes away from Clay, particularly in crucial states like New York, to make a real difference.
Wow. So that indecisiveness was fatal for him.
Arguably, yes. It cost him critical support he couldn't afford to lose.
Okay, so you've got Polk, clear on expansion, and Clay trying to compromise but stumbling. The stage is set for a pretty intense campaign.
Intense is putting it mildly. It was more like a political street fight.
Really? How did that play out?
Newspapers were viciously partisan, just attacking the other side relentlessly. Political cartoons were brutal.
No holds barred.
None. And stump speeches were key candidates and their surrogates traveling around giving these fiery speeches to huge crowds. It was direct, often personal.
What kinds of attacks were they using? What were the main lines of argument?
Well, the Democrats painted Clay as this out-of-touch elite, maybe even corrupt, involved in shady deals. Bargain and corruption accusations followed him.
Okay, and the Whigs.
They hit Polk for being unknown. Who is James K. Polk was a common refrain. They called him a puppet of Andrew Jackson, too inexperienced to lead.
But it sounds like Polk's message, that clear call for expansion, really resonated.
It absolutely did. That desire for land, whether it was Southern planters wanting more cotton land or settlers looking for new farms in the West, it was powerful.
A unifying theme in a way.
Yeah.
Even if the motives differed.
In a strange way, yes. Polk's straightforward stance on Texas and Oregon tapped right into that national mood, that energy.
So how did it all shake out? The results must have reflected this intensity.
They did, and they were incredibly close, much closer than the Electoral College might suggest.
Okay, give us the numbers.
Polk won the Electoral College fairly comfortably, 170 to 105 for Clay.
Seems decisive.
But the popular vote, razor thin. Polk won by less than 38,000 votes nationwide.
Wow, less than 2% difference.
Exactly. It just shows how incredibly divided the country was over these issues. A few thousand votes shifting in New York, for example, could have swung the entire election to Clay.
That's amazing. And then Texas gets annexed almost immediately.
Even before Polk takes the oath, the outgoing president, John Tyler, saw the writing on the wall after Polk's win.
Saw it as a mandate.
Pretty much. Tyler pushed the annexation through Congress in his final days in office, but Polk's victory was definitely seen as the public saying yes to expansion.
So Polk comes into office, mandate in hand, and serves just one term, as he promised. But it sounds like it was an eventful term.
Unbelievably eventful. You could call it a one-term thunderstorm. He achieved almost everything he set out to do.
Okay, let's tick through the big accomplishments. Texas annexation was done, but that led directly to
the Mexican-American War. From 1846 to 48.
And the outcome of that?
A decisive American victory. It ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo.
And that treaty meant?
A massive expansion of U.S. territory. Mexico ceded what is now California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. Over 500,000 square miles.
It's incredible. The shape of the modern West, basically.
Pretty much formed in that treaty. And Polk didn't stop there. He also resolved the Oregon dispute with Britain.
Right, 54-40 or fight. Did they fight?
Well, thankfully, they negotiated. Polk compromised, settling on the 49th parallel as the boundary.
Which is the border we have today with Canada in that region.
Exactly. So he secured the Pacific Northwest peacefully. Plus, he achieved some domestic goals, too. Brought back the independent treasury system, lowered tariffs. A very effective, focused president in terms of achieving his agenda.
But effective doesn't always mean uncontroversial, right?
Mm-hmm.
His legacy is complicated.
Very complicated. The Mexican-American War, for starters. Critics then and now called it a war of aggression, an imperial land grab.
Driven by the desire to expand slavery.
That was certainly a major accusation and a significant motivation for many supporters of the war. And ironically, or perhaps predictably, all this new land Polk acquired. It immediately blew the slavery debate wide open again.
Because now the question was, slave or free in these territories?
Precisely. The Wilmot Proviso, trying to ban slavery in the new lands, failed. But the fight over it dominated politics and set the stage directly for the conflicts of the 1850s.
Leading towards a civil war.
Absolutely. It intensified the sectional conflict dramatically. It's also said Polk worked himself to death, basically. He was relentless, took almost no time off.
And died soon after leaving office.
Just a few months later. A stark contrast to his incredibly impactful presidency.
So when we look back, 1844 wasn't just about choosing a president. It was about choosing a national path.
Definitely. It forced the U.S. to confront big questions. Was it going to be a continental empire? How would it handle the explosive issue of slavery as it expanded? Polk's victory provided clear, if controversial, answers at the time.
Answers that led to that vast map, but also
deepened the divisions that would soon tear the nation apart. The expansion Polk achieved made the existing compromises over slavery almost impossible to maintain. It forced the issue.
It feels like that election locked in a certain trajectory, making conflict much more likely.
I think that's fair to say. While it created the physical United States we largely know today, it simultaneously pushed the country much closer to civil war.
Okay, so summing up, we had this dark horse, Polk, ride a wave of expansionist fever to a very narrow victory.
Driven by manifest destiny, the Texas question, Oregon fever.
Right. And his presidency delivered on that expansionist promise in a huge way, redrawing the map.
Massively. But that very success poured fuel on the fire of the slavery debate, making the existing cracks in the nation into, well, chasms.
Leading ultimately to the Civil War less than 20 years later.
The connection is pretty direct. 1844 set the stage in a profound way.
Which leaves us with a really interesting thought to chew on. How different might things have looked if Henry Clay had won in 1844? If that expansionist push had been delayed or handled differently, how might that have changed the course of the slavery debate, and maybe even the path to war? It really makes you think about how pivotal these moments can be.